In the quiet town of Ashland, Elmwood Elementary stands as a symbol of discipline under the strict guidance of Miss Lacey Thorpe, whose unyielding approach keeps students in line but leaves no room for mistakes. 10-year-old Sarah Marshall has always tried to keep her head down, but when Miss Thorpe singles her out for harsh treatment, the humiliation runs deep. Unbeknownst to Lacey, Sarah's father, Adrian, a former teacher with his own painful past, is watching, and what he sees stirs long-buried regrets. As Adrian steps in to protect his daughter, his battle with Miss Thorpe reveals deeper wounds in both their lives. Determined to bring change, he risks his own healing in the process, ultimately uncovering a secret from Miss Thorpe's past that binds their fates. Can compassion and forgiveness transform Elmwood, or will the scars of old habits prove too deep to heal? In Ashland Public Park, Adrian and Sarah Marshall sit quietly on a worn bench near the playground, watching the early morning mist drift through the trees. Sarah, bundled in her favorite blue jacket, leans into her father's side as they sip hot chocolate from a shared thermos. "Are you looking forward to school tomorrow, sweetheart?" Adrian asks, his voice gentle. Sarah hesitates, her eyes fixed on a group of sparrows hopping on the grass. "Kind of, I guess." "Kind of?" Adrian chuckles lightly, though he senses the worry behind her words. "Anything you want to talk about?" She shrugs, biting her lip. "Miss Thorpe she's really strict, Dad. Sometimes I feel like I can't do anything right." Adrian's face clouds slightly, his past as a teacher stirring. He wraps his arm around her. "Well, maybe she thinks she's helping you be your best. But remember, you can always talk to me. I'll make sure it gets better." Sarah nods but doesn't look convinced. As they leave the park, Adrian feels a knot of concern forming in his chest, determined to find out more. In the crisp, orderly classroom of Elmwood Elementary, Miss Lacey Thorpe stands at the blackboard, chalk in hand. Her presence is firm, her gaze sharp, scanning the room as if every student holds a hidden offense. "Sarah Marshall, up front. Let's see if you've done your reading," she calls out, her tone authoritative. Sarah's cheeks turn pink as she moves slowly to the front of the class, eyes downcast. Miss Thorpe points to a complex sentence on the board. "Now, can you explain this in detail?" Sarah stumbles over her words, feeling the weight of Miss Thorpe's scrutiny. The teacher's expression hardens. "Is that really the best you can do, Sarah? Haven't you been paying attention in class?" "Yes, Miss Thorpe, I thought." Sarah's voice is barely a whisper, her shoulders slumping. Miss Thorpe's disapproving sigh fills the room, a chilling reminder of her expectations. "Sit down, and try to keep up next time." From the back of the room, a shadow stirs. Adrian, unnoticed by most, watches his daughter struggle, a heavy sadness settling over him. The school bell rings, signaling the end of the day. Adrian watches from the hallway as Sarah gathers her things slowly, keeping her head low. Miss Thorpe tidies her desk, her face still set in a firm, disapproving mask. Adrian steps back into the hallway, unnoticed, his mind churning with thoughts. "Sarah," he says softly as she steps out of the classroom, "you did your best today. I could see that." She glances up, surprised to see him there, her eyes still carrying the sting of Miss Thorpe's words. "It didn't feel like it, Dad." Adrian places a comforting hand on her shoulder. "Sometimes it's not about what they see. It's about knowing you tried." They walk home in silence, but Adrian's resolve is growing. He can't let her continue in an environment that chips away at her spirit. In the cozy warmth of their modest apartment, Adrian sits with Sarah at the kitchen table, where she fiddles with a pencil, drawing circles on a notepad. "Sarah," he begins, leaning forward, "tell me what it's really like with Miss Thorpe. I want to understand." She sighs, eyes glued to the notepad. "It's like she's always watching, like she's waiting for us to mess up. And when we do, she makes us feel stupid. Especially me." Adrian's heart aches. He'd been strict as a teacher once, believing it was for his students' good, but seeing the impact on his daughter is almost unbearable. "No one should make you feel that way. You deserve to feel safe and encouraged at school, not afraid." Sarah looks up, her expression a mix of relief and hope. "You really think so?" "Absolutely," he says firmly. I'm going to talk to someone about this. It's time things changed. The next morning, Adrian stands in the principal's office, his expression set. Principal Morris sits across from him, listening politely as Adrian describes his concerns. Miss Thorpe's methods are effective. Morris replies slowly, his tone wary. Her class always performs well. At what cost? Adrian counters. These are young kids. They need to be inspired, not pressured. My daughter comes home feeling like she can never do enough. Morris sighs, glancing at his files. I'll look into it, but Miss Thorpe has been with us for a long time. She's a valued teacher. Adrian nods, though frustration flickers across his face. Thank you, Principal Morris. I'll hold you to that. As he walks out of the office, Adrian feels the first stirring of determination. For Sarah's sake, he will make sure this doesn't go unanswered. The next steps are uncertain, but one thing is clear. He's just getting started. Adrian paces the hallway at Elmwood, his conversation with the principal weighing heavily on him. As he turns a corner, he nearly collides with Mrs. Reynolds, a soft-spoken teacher known for her empathetic approach. Mr. Marshall. She smiles warmly. I've been meaning to speak with you about Sarah. She's a wonderful student. Adrian nods, appreciative but cautious. Thank you, Mrs. Reynolds. I'm worried about Miss Thorpe's methods. Mrs. Reynolds' expression shifts, and she glances around before lowering her voice. You're not the first parent to feel that way. Miss Thorpe. Well, she believes in discipline, but it's hard for some kids. Adrian's eyes narrow slightly. Is there anything I can do? She hesitates but then sighs. The board has turned a blind eye. But if enough parents spoke up, Adrian gives her a grateful smile. Thank you, Mrs. Reynolds. You may have given me exactly what I needed. Back in Miss Thorpe's classroom, Sarah sits at her desk, silently determined after her father's encouragement. Miss Thorpe, however, seems even stricter than usual, perhaps aware of Adrian's concern. Miss Marshall, Miss Thorpe says icily, come to the board. Explain the answer. Sarah stands, feeling the eyes of her classmates on her. It's when you divide. Not even close. Miss Thorpe's voice is steely, her gaze cutting through Sarah's confidence. But instead of shrinking, Sarah meets Miss Thorpe's eyes. I'll try again. For a moment, Miss Thorpe seems taken aback, but she quickly schools her expression. Back to your seat, she snaps, but something in her tone is less certain. Sarah returns to her seat, heart pounding but head held high. Adrian steps into the school board office, his heart thudding as he presents his case. I'm here because I believe Miss Thorpe's teaching style is damaging. My daughter, many children, are suffering. The board members exchange glances, one of them finally speaking up. Mr. Marshall, we appreciate your concern, but Miss Thorpe has a record of strong results. But at what cost? Adrian interjects, his voice passionate. I've seen it. These kids are losing their love for learning. They're afraid. A board member clears his throat. We'll consider your input, Mr. Marshall. As Adrian leaves, he feels a flicker of hope. He's begun a process that, he hopes, can't be ignored. In her classroom, Miss Thorpe sits alone, the faint whispers of parents and teachers still echoing. She tightens her grip on her pen, her jaw set. Adrian's complaint feels like a betrayal, a direct challenge to her authority. When Mrs. Reynolds enters the room, Miss Thorpe's stare is hard. Is there something you needed, Mrs. Reynolds? Mrs. Reynolds hesitates, sensing the tension. Lacey, maybe you could ease up a little. The kids, they need discipline, Miss Thorpe snaps. It's the only way they'll succeed in this world. Mrs. Reynolds nods, retreating with a worried glance. Miss Thorpe's gaze returns to the empty classroom, her thoughts swirling with resentment. At home that evening, Adrian sits in his living room, his old teaching textbooks spread out before him. Memories of his own teaching days, both the good and the bad, surface as he contemplates how far he'll go to protect Sarah and change Elmwood. Dad. Sarah appears at the doorway, watching him. Will it get better? Adrian smiles gently. Yes, Sarah. I'll make sure of it. Things are going to change. He looks back at his books, a new determination building. He isn't just fighting for Sarah. He's fighting to be the teacher he wished he'd been. Adrian sits at the kitchen table, a cup of tea cooling in his hands as he watches Sarah do her homework. A pang of guilt rises in his chest as memories of his own classroom surface. "Dad," Sarah asks, glancing up, Did you ever have teachers like Miss Thorpe?" Adrian sighs, his eyes distant. "Actually, I used to be a lot like her. I thought being strict was the only way to help my students learn." Sarah's eyes widen. "Really? But you're kind. You listen." A small smile plays on Adrian's lips. "I had to learn that the hard way, sweetheart. I saw students struggle under my own tough standards, just like you're experiencing now." She absorbs his words, nodding slowly. "But you changed. Do you think Miss Thorpe can?" He pauses, considering. "Maybe, if she's willing to see things differently. I'll do my best to help." The next day, Adrian finds Miss Thorpe in the hallway after school. She's organizing papers, her back straight as a rod. He approaches her carefully. "Miss Thorpe, could we speak for a moment?" She glances up, eyebrows raised. "Yes, Mr. Marshall?" Adrian takes a breath. "I understand that you believe in discipline, but I think there's room for a gentler approach. The kids, they're scared. I know because I used to be like you." She stiffens. "Are you suggesting my methods aren't effective?" "Not exactly. I just think there's a way to reach them without fear. Maybe consider easing up." Her eyes flash with a mixture of defensiveness and something else. "Maybe hurt? I do what I think is best, Mr. Marshall. These students need discipline, and I don't apologize for that." Adrian steps back, nodding. "I hope you'll consider it." She watches him walk away, her expression conflicted. In the following class, Miss Thorpe notices Sarah's quiet defiance. She calls on her for a challenging question, fully expecting hesitation. Sarah takes a deep breath. "I'm not sure about the answer, Miss Thorpe, but I can try." Miss Thorpe's expression is unreadable as she watches Sarah attempt the answer. "Trying is a start, I suppose," she says, a faint softness in her tone. The other students seem to sense Sarah's courage, exchanging glances. Even Miss Thorpe's usual edge feels lessened, and for the first time, the class breathes a little easier. Later, Adrian approaches Miss Thorpe again, hoping her softened approach to Sarah might be a sign. "Miss Thorpe, I saw how you handled Sarah today. She felt supported, even if she didn't get the answer right." Miss Thorpe frowns, her guard immediately rising. "It was one moment, Mr. Marshall. Discipline is still essential." He sighs, frustration seeping into his voice. "Discipline is important, yes, but you could try encouraging them more." She crosses her arms, her tone frosty. "Thank you for the advice, but I'll continue as I see fit." Realizing he's hit a wall, Adrian nods, resigned. "Very well." Determined not to give up, Adrian gathers with other parents and teachers after hours. Mrs. Reynolds joins, nodding in solidarity. "We've all seen what Miss Thorpe's methods do to the kids," Adrian begins. "We need to approach the board together." One of the parents raises a hand. "And if they ignore us?" "Then we keep trying," Adrian replies. "This isn't just about Sarah. It's about creating a safe space for every student here." The group exchanges determined glances, a unified front forming. Adrian leaves, hopeful that change is on the horizon. The school auditorium is buzzing with chatter as parents and students gather for Elmwood's monthly assembly. Adrian stands at the back, watching Sarah fidget nervously as she waits with her classmates. Miss Thorpe enters the stage with her usual cold precision, and the audience quiets. After a few routine announcements, she shifts her attention to the fourth grade class. "Now, we'll hear a few students share their projects," she says. She glances at Sarah, her gaze sharpening. "Sarah, why don't you come up and explain your project?" Sarah looks at Adrian, who gives her an encouraging nod. She steps up, clutching her paper, and begins reading softly, her voice trembling. But before she finishes, Miss Thorpe interrupts. "Speak up, Sarah. If you can't explain your own work confidently, how can anyone take it seriously?" A murmur ripples through the audience. Adrian's jaw tightens as he watches his daughter's shoulders slump. Miss Thorpe's scorn is palpable, and a few parents exchange shocked glances. After the assembly, Adrian approaches Sarah, who's fighting back tears. "You did great, honey. Don't let anyone make you feel small." As they leave, he catches the disapproving stares of other parents directed at Miss Thorpe. He feels a shift. Maybe, just maybe, others will stand with him now. The following day, Adrian storms into Principal Morris's office, his frustration barely contained. Principal Morris, yesterday's assembly was unacceptable, he says, his voice firm. My daughter, and many others, deserve respect, not ridicule. Principal Morris sighs, looking weary. Mr. Marshall, we've discussed this. Miss Thorpe's methods are outdated and harmful, Adrian interrupts, his tone unyielding. Parents are starting to see it. She's humiliating these kids, and it's affecting them deeply. Morris shifts uncomfortably in his chair. I understand your concerns, but Miss Thorpe has tenure. She's been here for years. That doesn't excuse her behavior, Adrian counters. If we can't get her to change, then maybe it's time to consider alternatives. The principal nods slowly. I'll look into it. But please, Mr. Marshall, understand that these things take time. Adrian leaves, more determined than ever. He knows he's pushing Morris's limits, but his daughter's well-being, and that of her classmates, is worth it. In the classroom, Sarah sits with her head down, but something within her is shifting. Her father's encouragement has kindled a small flame of defiance. As Miss Thorpe continues with her harsh critique of another student's work, Sarah raises her hand. Yes, Sarah? Miss Thorpe asks, with a sharp look of surprise. I think that everyone deserves a chance to try without feeling scared, Sarah says, her voice trembling but resolute. Miss Thorpe's eyes narrow. Are you suggesting my methods are wrong, Sarah? Sarah glances at her classmates, then nods slowly. It's just, when we're afraid, it's hard to learn. My dad says learning should be about trying, not being perfect right away. A silence fills the room, broken only by the quiet murmur of other students nodding in agreement. Miss Thorpe's jaw clenches, and for the first time, her expression softens, a fraction, but enough for the class to notice. Well, she finally says, her tone less severe. Thank you for sharing, Sarah. A week later, Adrian receives a call from the school board. His complaints have sparked an investigation, and a representative meets with him in the school library. Mr. Marshall, we appreciate you bringing this to our attention, says Mrs. Lawson, a board representative. We've received a few similar concerns from other parents since you spoke up. Adrian nods, relief washing over him. It's good to know that others feel the same way. She smiles. Miss Thorpe's tenure complicates things, but we are committed to ensuring that every child feels safe and supported. What's the next step? He asks, hopeful. We'll begin by observing her classes, and she'll be asked to attend workshops on student engagement and emotional intelligence. Change won't happen overnight, but we'll be monitoring her closely. Adrian leaves the meeting feeling lighter. It's a small victory, but one that could make a big difference for Sarah and the other children. That evening, Adrian and Sarah sit together in the living room, her head resting on his shoulder as he reads her favorite book aloud. Dad, she whispers, do you think Miss Thorpe will ever be different? Adrian pauses, considering his words carefully. I don't know, sweetheart, but I promise you, no matter what happens, I'll keep fighting for you and all the other kids. You deserve a school where you feel safe and respected. Sarah smiles, a glimmer of hope in her eyes. Thanks, Dad. As they sit in comfortable silence, Adrian knows his journey isn't over. He'll continue working for a positive change, committed to making Elmwood a better place for his daughter and her classmates. Miss Thorpe sits alone in her empty classroom, the silence pressing down around her. The recent board inquiry and the murmurs of discontent from parents weigh heavily on her mind. She looks over the rows of empty desks, each a reminder of the students she believes she's preparing for the world's harsh realities. As she traces the grain of her desk, a memory surfaces. A young Lacey Thorpe, nervous and hesitant, scolded in front of the class by her own teacher. She had vowed never to let anyone see her weaknesses again. Toughness builds resilience, she whispers to herself, though the words ring hollow. Just then, Mrs. Reynolds enters quietly, breaking the silence. Lacey, are you all right? Miss Thorpe straightens, forcing her usual composed demeanor. I'm fine, Helen. Mrs. Reynolds hesitates. Maybe, just maybe, It's time to try something different. Sometimes being strong means adapting. Miss Thorpe says nothing, but as Mrs. Reynolds leaves, a flicker of doubt lingers in her mind, unsettling her sense of control. Principal Morris meets Adrian in his office, an air of apology hanging over him. Mr. Marshall, I wanted to speak with you about the recent events. Adrian raises an eyebrow, waiting. Morris sighs. I should have listened sooner. Miss Thorpe's approach. It's clear now that it's been damaging, and I regret not acting on your concerns right away. Adrian softens, appreciating the admission. Thank you for saying that. All I wanted was a safe space for my daughter, and for every other child here. Principal Morris nods. We're working on some changes, and, well, the board is interested in expanding the student counseling program. They wanted to know if you'd consider a role here, helping to guide the school's growth. Adrian feels a rush of purpose. I'd be honored. I've always believed that compassion should be at the heart of education. As they shake hands, Adrian knows this is just the beginning of a new chapter for Elmwood. Back in the classroom, Sarah stands beside her latest project, her posture more confident than ever. The room buzzes with anticipation. Students and parents gather to view the presentations. Miss Thorpe watches with folded arms, but there's a softness in her gaze as Sarah speaks. Sarah's voice is steady as she explains her project, occasionally glancing at her father in the back, who smiles with pride. When she finishes, the room erupts in applause, and Miss Thorpe even gives a reserved nod. As Sarah sits down, her classmates whisper words of encouragement, and a boy nearby says, "That was awesome, Sarah." For the first time, Sarah feels truly accepted, her earlier insecurities beginning to fade. Adrian watches from the back, heart swelling with pride at his daughter's courage and growth. Later that week, Adrian walks into the office marked counselor for the first time. The room is modest, but it holds a sense of potential. Posters of encouragement line the walls, and a few potted plants add warmth to the space. As he arranges his new desk, Miss Thorpe appears at the doorway, hesitant. Mr. Marshall, she begins, her voice softer than usual. I heard you'll be joining us as a counselor. Adrian nods, his expression open. Yes, I'll be working with students, helping them navigate school life. She shifts uncomfortably. I suppose that could be useful. Adrian smiles gently. And I think we could work well together, Lacey. Maybe find some balance. Miss Thorpe nods, her posture stiff but her tone respectful. I suppose it's worth considering. As she walks away, Adrian feels hopeful. His role is not only to help students, but also to foster a spirit of cooperation and empathy within the school. In the following days, Miss Thorpe's demeanor begins to soften, especially around Sarah and her classmates. She assigns group projects, encouraging collaboration, and even allows more time for questions, a small but noticeable change that doesn't go unnoticed. During a math lesson, Sarah timidly raises her hand. Miss Thorpe, could we work on this problem as a group? Miss Thorpe pauses, then nods. Yes, Sarah. I think that's a good idea. The students exchange surprised smiles, and the atmosphere in the room lightens. As the class works together, Miss Thorpe observes quietly, a hint of satisfaction in her expression. She's beginning to understand that teaching is more than enforcing rules. It's guiding growth, just as Adrian had suggested. The atmosphere in Miss Thorpe's classroom has softened noticeably, though her stern demeanor remains intact. She watches as the students work in groups on a math exercise, something she would never have allowed before. Observing their collaborative spirit, she feels an unexpected sense of pride mixed with vulnerability. Adrian walks into the classroom, and Miss Thorpe's expression shifts slightly. Mr. Marshall, she acknowledges, her voice controlled. Miss Thorpe, he replies warmly. It's nice to see the students working together. They seem more engaged. She nods, her eyes distant. Perhaps I underestimated the value of connection, she admits quietly. Adrian smiles, sensing her hesitation. There's strength in empathy, Lacey. And I think you're discovering that. As he leaves, Miss Thorpe feels a weight lift. Though it's challenging, she realizes she is finally ready to embrace change, even if it means confronting her own past. After school, Sarah approaches Miss Thorpe's desk, her heart racing. Miss Thorpe, can I talk to you for a moment? Miss Thorpe looks up, surprised by the girl's bravery. Of course, Sarah. Sarah takes a breath, gathering her thoughts. I just wanted to say, I forgive you. For everything. Her voice trembles but remains steady. I know you were trying to help us in your way, even if it hurts sometimes. Miss Thorpe's eyes soften, and for a moment, she struggles to respond. Thank you, Sarah. That means more than you know. They share a silent understanding, and Miss Thorpe feels a profound sense of relief. Sarah's words resonate, allowing Miss Thorpe to begin letting go of the anger she's held for so long. Later that evening, Adrian reflects on the journey he's traveled with Sarah and the impact on Elmwood. Sitting in his new office, he pulls out an old journal from his teaching days, skimming through the notes and strict lessons he once enforced. A mix of regret and pride fills him as he recognizes how far he's come. When Sarah stops by after her class, he looks up, smiling. You've taught me a lot. You know that? Sarah grins. Me? Adrian nods. You've shown me that it's never too late to change. That compassion is just as powerful as discipline. They share a warm embrace, both feeling the strength of the bond they've forged, grateful for the lessons learned together. Over the next few weeks, changes ripple through Elmwood. Under Adrian's guidance as the new counselor, teachers begin incorporating more inclusive practices, focusing on both academics and emotional well-being. The students feel a newfound energy, and even the staff seem lighter. Principal Morris stops by Adrian's office one afternoon, nodding with approval. You've made a real difference here, Adrian. The students, the teachers, even the board has noticed. Adrian smiles, a sense of fulfillment settling over him. It was a team effort, but thank you. I'm grateful for the opportunity. As Morris leaves, Adrian glances at the empty chairs in his office, envisioning future students sitting there, knowing that Elmwood has become a place of growth and healing. On the last day of the school year, Miss Thorpe calls Sarah to her desk, her expression uncharacteristically soft. Sarah, there's something I'd like to share with you. She begins, her voice faltering. Sarah nods, listening intently as Miss Thorpe takes a deep breath. When I was young, I had a teacher who believed in discipline above all else. I thought being tough was the only way to protect myself and others. But I realize now that I was wrong. Sarah's eyes widen, surprised by Miss Thorpe's vulnerability. Miss Thorpe smiles faintly. You've taught me that compassion is far more powerful. Thank you, Sarah. With a final nod, Miss Thorpe gathers her things, ready to retire, leaving behind a transformed classroom. Watching her go, Sarah feels a sense of closure, knowing that, together, they have redefined what strength truly means.